Okay, so attachment style and lifestyle. Exploring the connection through quantitative research. This is my journal article critique, and I'm Nick Pachichi. So we have purpose, question, and hypothesis. So the purpose of the study was to empirically investigate and determine if there's a connection between attachment style and lifestyle. And that's Adlerian's style of life, which is kind of correlated to personality. Now, the hypothesis here is that there's some overlapping connection between these two concepts, and just based on that information, we can kind of we feel the idea that this is a correlational study and a relationship study. Um, Even though like the actual question, research question, wasn't spelled out in the opening few paragraphs. Furthermore, there wasn't really an indication of what population that was going to be used, or the methods, or the instrumentation. But they do get to that later, and so let's get to later. All right, here's later. So this was a descriptive quantitative survey / personal inventory study for determining correlation. Participants were 329 undergraduate psych students from 2 regional locations, both in the East, North, and South. Now, if you just start looking at some of these numbers here about the participants, we can kind of start getting an inkling of possible flaws that are going to emerge from this study. I won't get in that right now, but just lay that groundwork right there. Again, this is a convenient sample. I snuck that in the bottom right corner, which is going to start bringing up other possible sampling biases. And again, that's just how they did it, where they did it. And let's keep going. The instruments used, the Basis A inventory is the basic Adlerian scales for interpersonal success, which is a 65-item list designed to measure style of life on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree, with an alpha coefficient of 0.82 to 0.87. And the ECR, and the ECRR, experiences in close relationships in inventory, revised. 36-item list with 18 anxiety questions and 18 avoidance kind of measurements on a 7-point Likert scale, which is similar, just a little bit more broadened, with the R coefficient of 0.93 and 0.95. Now, looking into these R coefficients, there's a lot of agreements that anything between 0.6 and 0.7 is good, 0.8 to 0.9 really good, and then you start nearing 1, because the range here is all the way to +1 to -1 in correlation. You start to get a little bit curious, and sometimes the more nearly you get to 1, people start to think that maybe you should revise your questionnaire. Maybe there's a little bit too much redundancy in the questions that aren't showing the differences. So you might need to change the wording, change the question, change the order, maybe change the length. That's just something to think about, but they went with it, so let's go with it too. All right, so analyzing the results. There was a correlational analysis, a regression analysis, and discriminant functional analysis. Now, I'm going to pretend I know 100% what each one of those are, and just trust that what they said was there was an indication that there's some sort of relationship between these two, even if it doesn't indicate a precise pattern. Now, interestingly enough, what they say is that there's a moderate yet significant correlation. Now, this could seem a little bit like an oxymoron there, to be like, yeah, there is, but it's slight, but it's big. So that's just something to question when you read it. But one interesting thing is that 7 out of 10 of the Basis A scales could start predicting the scores on the anxiety and attachment scales. Now, if we can start making valid predictions from one to the other, then that does, even if they're not entirely connected or causal, it does hint at relationships. So that's interesting. So again, the researchers probably hope that this moderate yet significant correlation could be the first empirical evidence to connect these two concepts, and also necessitate the need for further research. Now, the magnitude of the prediction that they were able to make from the Basis A to the anxiety or the avoidance scales was interesting. Now, on the anxiety scale, it was only able to account for 30% of the variance, which is okay, and then on the avoidance scale, it was only able to account for 9% of the variance. Now, is this good? Cohen in 1977 said that for social sciences, any findings that explain 10% of variability should be considered good outcomes. Furthermore, Trusty Thompson and Selly say that more than the effect size, it's the notion that the findings that are replicable, right? And so the example they used was not smoking and incidence of cancer only have a 2% variance. So someone that doesn't smoke can only explain about 2% of the people that don't get cancer. And just knowing that 2% could have a much bigger effect on our understanding of how these relationships are connected. So there is reason to believe that there is some sort of thing happening here, but I will juxtapose this. I put alternate thoughts in the bottom there. Is that in the harder sciences, they trust a variance number of 60% or higher in order to be valid, statistically significant. So perhaps that just speaks to the differences in social sciences versus some of the more rigorous hard sciences. And just, we're dealing with concepts that aren't just A plus B equals C. There's much more nuance, much more complexity. And so maybe we have to lower the threshold for some of the things that we consider a relationship. But we'll continue. Critique. So these are some of the issues that were here. Again, the sampling issue was that it was a convenient sample. It wasn't random. It was a small segment of the population that was chosen, which is now susceptible to sampling biases. Beyond that methodology, there was just the idea of taking survey and inventory creates other issues too. So you have possible distortions and other biases, which depends on the wording of the question. Again, the question order, length, and the context of when this survey was given. I think the example in Hauser was, if you give a political questionnaire in an election cycle, you're going to have much differences than when it just ended. And so this, just like these possible distortion biases could happen. Again, the cost benefit analysis, that it is more convenient, it's easier, and you can try to get a little bit more of the intuitive things that people feel rather than being able to observe it. But again, when there's this other weird thing that happens when people know they're being studied, that they want to present themselves a little better or different than they are. So you might end up having some of this process error happening there too with the bias. Also, another interesting thing that came up was that the ECR and the ECRR are almost exclusively related to romantic partners and relationships, not all relationships. So there is a questionable link whether or not the parent relationship can be extended to the adult romantic relationship. So those are just a couple of the methodological issues that could come up. Possible underlying assumptions. So it seemed pretty clear that the researchers are very much on the side of attachment theory, and based on this, it could bias the design, the implementation, the analysis, and the conclusions through confirmation bias or even demand characteristics. So if you really want something to happen, you're really working to prove it, you're going to do whatever you can to start seeing those patterns, and it could start influencing the way everything evolves around that. And then let's say I design the questions that kind of lead to a certain ideology, and people taking this survey start to pick up on that. They might start, slightly giving you what you want because, like, oh, I can kind of see what they're hinting at here, and that starts to kind of mess with the data too. So possible line assumptions, that's one. That could probably be for the possible critique as well. And again, the assumption that Adlerian lifestyle is already effective in treatment. So the main part was to put attachment theory and connect it to Adlerian therapy, just to say, hey, this is a similar concept that works. This should work too. So they're trying to bolster their attachment theory credentials there. Conflicts of interest. So again, for attachment theorists, there's obviously this goal of trying to connect it to a well-validated instrument, the basis A and Adlerian style of life. And again, this next part is key here, is that since Adlerian lifestyle is being used in family therapy, stress, coping, leadership, aggression, prison populations. If we can show that this is a similar concept, maybe we can get our footing into those aspects as well. So there's something to gain for attachment theorists. And then there was a little bit of a quid pro quo there for Adlerians, which is like, hey, if this does work, then maybe this will open up a new branch of some of your conceptual frameworks that you can play with too. Other conflicts unclear, but I should underline funding here 10 times. If depending on who's funding this, would probably indicate kind of where the main conflicts arise, but I don't know that. I couldn't find anything on that. And this is what the sampling bias is pretty much all signals around here, is a lack of multicultural consideration from the study. And maybe there was an attempt to, but just based on the convenient sample, they just didn't have that. Maybe they didn't have enough funding. But since the population was so small in two little small areas in the region, and there were only college psych students, we have to first wonder what the socioeconomic status of these individuals were. Now, since it was a small college, maybe it wasn't super affluent, but maybe it wasn't as impoverished as other places are, which is going to have a dramatic effect on possible outcomes. The majority were women as opposed to men, and the majority were Caucasian as opposed to other ethnic minorities and ethnicities. In fact, in I think it was the South. It could have been both, but I think it was in the South where they combined Hispanics, Asian Americans, and other into one category just for statistical necessity. And I think when you have to do that, you're gonna have some flaws that arise. And so, yeah, in order to make these findings more prominent and to be able to generalize them to a larger population, you probably want to do some more research in diverse areas to consider. And these are the references. Give it a second on that. And well, that's about it. Let's see if I can get out of here. All right, thanks.